Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's installment of our Toward a More Perfect Union series. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the great pleasure of serving as Director of Operations and Scholarship for the United States Capitol Historical Society. And we're so grateful that so many of you have taken time out of your busy week to learn some interesting history and some important history with us. Before we get started with today's program, I have a couple of technical housekeeping matters to bring to your attention. We love using this Zoom webinar platform to engage with you, our audience, while we can't get together in person, because it affords us a few ways that we can interact as presenters to you, the audience, and with you. If you have any content-based questions for Dr. Kraut today, as we go through the presentation and the question and answer session, you can submit those in the Q&A section of the webinar platform. That looks like two speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what kind of device you're using to join us today. Now, if you have any technical troubleshooting matters, if you feel like you're having difficulty seeing us or hearing us, you can put those sorts of questions into the chat function, which looks like a single speech bubble, and I will be responding to those in real time. So once again, any content-based questions for Professor Kraut can go into the Q&A section of the webinar. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you the President and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, to start today's program. Jane?
Thank you, Sam, and thank you always for your leadership on our scholarship activities, for finding the right speaker at the right time, and we are really very grateful for your work to make sure the communication is working as it should. So let me tell you about today's adventure. We have been doing this series since October of last year, and it is our series that we call Toward a More Perfect Union. We thought it was important that we acknowledge that the founders of our country, yes, they were all men, yes, they were all white, yes, some of them even owned people and thought that was okay. Nevertheless, they put together a Constitution and a Declaration of Independence and a set of American values that focused on equality for all and participation in our government by all of us. And so they just didn't have the right definition of all of us. And it has been a process of getting that definition to really include all of us over the years. So we have covered issues of race, issue of engagement by women, and today we are talking about the issue of immigration. We have today as our distinguished speaker, Dr. Alan Kraut. Dr. Kraut is a distinguished professor of history at American University, a non-resident fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, and also has an appointment at the Armed Services Medical School. His specialty is immigration, ethnic history, and the history of medicine in the United States. He's the author of several books, including The Huddled Masses, The Immigrant in American Society, 1880 to 1921, Silent Travelers, Germs, Genes, and the Immigrant Menace, and many others that talk about the work of immigrants. And in many ways, as he described it when we were talking, that we have sort of a love-hate relationship with immigrants. We want people to come to this country, but we're not sure how to really incorporate them. And so it has been a challenge, and we look forward to his presentation. He has become, interestingly, he's become not only the go-to person on matters of immigration, but particularly because 10 years ago, he wrote about the question of immigration and the 1918 pandemic. And so a few reporters found that article, and he's been asked questions about the current matter. So in our Q&A, we can refer to those questions. And so we now invite Professor Kraut to walk us through how has Congress engaged with immigration over the years, and where are we? What have we been through in this country as we look at immigrants? Dr. Kraut.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Jane Campbell, and I want to thank Sam Holliday for inviting me to be with you this afternoon. It's truly a pleasure. Let me begin by seeing if I can successfully share my screen with you. There we go. Okay. What we're looking at now is, of course, the Statue of Liberty, which has become the symbol for the United States, and of course is intimately connected with the whole notion of immigration. And the reason for that is largely the work of one young woman, a poetess named Emma Lazarus. And as many of you know, in the year 1883, Emma Lazarus wrote a poem called The New Colossus. Most of the poem is not very memorable, except for one stanza, which school children sometimes still memorize. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. That stanza is on a plaque at the base of the Statue of Liberty. And in 1883, it was written by Emma Lazarus as part of a fundraising campaign for the base of the Statue of Liberty, which would ultimately be erected in 1886. There is an irony here, and the irony is that 1 year before this poem was presented, Congress passed a highly restrictive law, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so here was a country that on the one hand seemed to be embracing immigration, and on the other hand was highly restrictive. The irony was certainly never lost on immigrants themselves. A very popular 19th century saying among immigrants of many different groups was, America beckons, but Americans repel. America beckons, but Americans repel. What a paradox that was. And so in my work, I often describe our country's relationship to immigration as a kind of love-hate relationship. And expressions of xenophobia well precede the founding of the Republic. In fact, Benjamin Franklin had some severe reservations about immigrants, especially the German migrants he encountered in Pennsylvania. Use of the German language and other cultural differences really aroused Franklin's ire, angered him greatly. Bitter that the Germans voted in a bloc, and usually for his political opponents, Franklin fumed about German boors and only half facetiously advised English-speaking Pennsylvanians to learn German, lest they feel like strangers on the street of their homeland. And Franklin didn't hesitate to commit his views to paper. His pamphlet, Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind, which he published in 1751, charged that German arrivals were swarming into communities on this side of the Atlantic, and by herding together, was seeking to establish their language and their manners to the exclusion of ours, as he put it. He feared, and he said this explicitly, that Pennsylvania was going to become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion. Well, Franklin was hardly alone. Thomas Jefferson also had his doubts about immigration. He wrote in a 1785 volume that many of you may be familiar with, Notes on the State of Virginia, his reservations about what he called the present desire of America to produce rapid population by as great importation of foreigners as possible. He didn't like it. His concern was that newcomers who were arriving in ever larger numbers might not share a belief in the fundamental principles of government appreciated by the founders, especially, as he put it, the freest principles of the English Constitution, with others derived from natural right and natural reason. And so Jefferson was really afraid that these folks who were coming from monarchies would bring their monarchical views with them and be unable to adjust to American democracy. Jefferson, of course, himself a slave owner, as many of the founders were, nevertheless concerned about the future of freedom, the future of democracy on this side of the Atlantic, and fearful that newcomers would not appreciate it the way he did. Well, those who drafted the Constitution did not see fit to treat immigration and grant to Congress the responsibility to make laws about who should be admitted and who excluded, or to in any way describe an administrative process for the interrogation and inspection of new arrivals. But naturalization, that was another matter. American citizens could be made as well as born. And the Constitution, which was ratified in 1788, granted the federal government authority to pass legislation establishing naturalization. Immigration, that was to be left to the states. The only other evidence of concern that the foreign-born might gain power over the native-born Americans resides really in the qualification for the highest offices in government. And some of you who are as old as I am, or almost, may remember that when there was talk of Henry Kissinger running for president of the United States, everyone said, well, he wasn't born in the United States. He would have to, after all, there'd be a special bill to allow him to serve as president if he were elected. In fact, in American history, the foreign-born have held every office to which they are entitled by the Constitution except for one, and that is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In any case, debates over naturalization in 1790 reveal concerns over encouraging inclusion. In a debate in the House of Representatives over naturalization that year, James Madison stated quite firmly that the young country should welcome those who could assimilate, but exclude the immigrant who could not readily, and these are Madison's words, incorporate himself into our society. Well, Madison was hardly alone in those feelings. Others too thought naturalization of new arrivals must be contingent upon their willingness and their ability to become integrated with the native born, accepting the values, the attitudes, and the beliefs of their adopted country. Those wishing citizenship had to choose to conform to the ways and the beliefs of those who preceded them. And those of you who have read George Washington's 1796 farewell address know that he described American citizens as defined by place of birth or, quote, choice of a common country. Washington defined Americans as individuals who, with slight shades of difference, had the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. And these they could acquire by choice. You didn't have to be born to them. And George Washington heartily had advocated integrating newcomers into American life. He believed that by an intermixture of our people, immigrants or their descendants would get assimilated to the prevailing customs, the measures, the laws, in a word, soon become one people. Again, Washington was a slave owner, and he did not include in one people, people of color. And certainly in terms of rights and privileges, not so much women as well. In any case, the Alien and Sedition Laws of 1798 were laws passed by Congress and signed by Washington's Federalist successor, John Adams. And they were expressly designed to cripple the chances of Jeffersonian Republicans capturing the presidency in 1800. This was going to be a big standoff between Adams and Jefferson. Of these acts, the Naturalization Act increased the residency requirement for American citizenship from 5 to 14 years, which was a big leap. And at the time, the majority of immigrants supported Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, who were Adams' political opponents. The Alien Friends Act allowed the president to imprison or to deport aliens considered dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States at any time. And the third act, the Alien Enemies Act, authorized the president to do the same to any male citizen of a hostile nation above the age of 14 during times of war. The acts were, of course, unsuccessful. Jefferson became the next president of the United States, and the acts expired in 1803. But the concern about the foreign-born and the meaning of having so many newcomers arrive continued. By the 1830s, a mass migration was beginning, which would bring millions of newcomers to the United States. Many of them Irish or Germans or Scandinavians, and many of those Irish and Germans Roman Catholics, to this a country that was very largely Protestant. Between 1840 and 1860, more than 4.5 million newcomers arrived. Again, mostly from Ireland and Germany. Among the nativists was this fellow. Many of you know him or of him. His name was Samuel F.B. Morse, and we know him because he was the inventor of the telegraph. But he was also a virulent nativist, anti-immigrant, and especially anti-Catholic. He saw the Catholic Church as a foreign power hell-bent on interfering with our elections. He wrote in one of his pamphlets, "It is a fact that Roman Catholic priests have interfered to influence our elections." And then he added, "It is a fact that politicians on both sides have propitiated these priests to obtain the votes of their people," end quote. Well, not all the Catholics that Morse was concerned about were Irish. In fact, after the Mexican War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, stipulated that those Mexicans who were living on land that was part of the Mexican cession, that was now going to be part of the United States, actually had the option of staying on their land and enjoying full American citizenship, and they had a year to decide after the signing of the treaty. And so, in a sense, they were not immigrants to the United States. The United States, in effect, engulfed them. But most of the Mexicans were Roman Catholic, and so along with the Irish and German Catholics became part of the ire of many nativists. Another group that immigrated to the United States in the pre-Civil War period were the Chinese. They had heard about the gold rush in California, and many of them came to find gold, and most of them did not. Instead, they found jobs in American mines, jobs in construction, building the railroad, in this case, the Central Pacific Railroad that you see. And so the Chinese became yet another variable. They were not even Christians. And that point was pointed out by nativists again and again and again. In the 1850s, opposition to immigration and anti-Catholic sentiment found a place at the table of American politics in many states and municipalities. The crumbling of the American party system and the demise of the Whig Party left room for secret societies like the Order of the United Americans, the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, to coalesce into a new political party grounded in nativism, grounded in anti-immigrant sentiment. And this was, of course, the Know Nothing Party. This is one of their banners. And they were called the Know Nothings because since they started out as members of secret societies that coalesced into a very public political party, when they would be asked about their background, the organizations that they emerged from, they would simply say, I know nothing. I know nothing. And so they became known as the Know Nothings. Their focus was on state and local politics, which made sense because the states, not the federal government, administered immigration policy, such as it was. And they became a rather powerful force in some states, including Massachusetts, which had a very busy port. And so the Know Nothings built themselves as a party, articulating opposition to immigration at all costs. In the meantime, immigrants continued to come to the United States. And in 1855, New York converted an old fort into the New York State Emigration Depot, charged with interrogating newcomers and, with the help of volunteer physicians, inspecting the bodies of newcomers to exclude those who might be carriers of infectious disease or who were simply too weak physically to support themselves, only to end up on the rolls of private charities or in municipal almshouses. By the way, those of you who have been to either the Statue of Liberty or Ellis Island recently bought your ticket in what remains of those thick walls that had once been part of a fort. And in the 1850s was now an immigration station. So the Park Service administers this site, and you can walk around it and see they have some really interesting photographs on the walls inside. At around this time in 1855, an up-and-coming politician in the state of Illinois was very much aware of the opposition to immigration. That, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. And in an 1855 letter to his Springfield, Illinois friend Joshua Speed, Lincoln wrote about the Know Nothings and his feelings about them. He said, quote, "I am not a Know Nothing. That is certain. How could I be? How can anyone who abhors the oppression of Negroes be in favor of degrading classes of white people? When Know Nothings get control, our Declaration of Independence will read, all men are created equal, except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some other country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy," end quote. Given the current state of things with Russia, it seems that Lincoln was a bit prescient. In 1860, Lincoln ran on a platform that came out against any change in our naturalization laws or any state legislation by which the rights of citizens hitherto accorded to immigrants from foreign lands shall be abridged or impaired, and in favor of giving a full and efficient protection to the rights of all classes of citizens, whether native or naturalized, both at home and abroad. And so in 1860, the Republicans were foursquare on the side of treating immigrants decently. Now, because immigration was a matter left to the states, battles at the polls and in the streets over the proper role of immigrants in the US were constants on the floor of state and territorial legislatures. And while the states on the coast tried to cope with the perceived threat from abroad by exclusion at the ports, other states, especially those without coasts, sought to exclude newcomers by forbidding them from owning land in those states. Well before Nebraska graduated from federal territory to statehood in 1854, its territorial legislature sought to exclude from land ownership those who were not American citizens. The Preemption Act of 1841 allowed settlers to file a preemptive claim to up to 160 acres of land, protecting their title against later claims by others on the same tract. Those wishing to benefit from this act that way had to provide proof of citizenship or a declaration that they were going to be pursuing citizenship. Other states were even clearer in their intention. In 1859, Oregon rewrote its constitution to read that, and I quote, "No Chinaman can own property in the state." 3 years later, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Homestead Act, which allowed settlers to claim up to 160 acres of land on which they promised to live and to work. And included in the language of the law was provision that homesteaders be citizens or have filed for citizenship. And he also encouraged to pass the Immigration Act of 1864. As you file through your mental Rolodex, you may not have one for the Immigration Act of 1864 because many people don't know that Lincoln advocated a federal law which would encourage the recruitment of foreign labor to come to the United States. And it was passed by Congress and signed by the president on July 4th, 1864. But in July 1865, after the assassination of Lincoln, the act was repealed. And it was repealed by those fearing frauds being perpetrated against immigrants who would be asked to put up money to finance their passage. And it was opposed by workers who disliked the idea of contract labor from abroad, especially those laborers who would be coming from Asia. There's great fear about Chinese strike breakers. In the decades after the Civil War, nativists in a variety of states used legislation limiting land ownership to achieve their ends. And so often, as in Oregon, the targets were Asians. In 1879, as Californians were campaigning in Congress to shut down Chinese labor migration, the state actually revised its constitution to limit land ownership to aliens, and this is the language of the law, of the white race or of African descent. So if you were white or black, you could own land. Soon other territorial legislatures on the West Coast, such as the state of Washington, would seek to exclude those from land ownership who were ineligible for citizenship. In 1882, Congress passed two important acts that began a pattern of legislative restriction. One was the Chinese Exclusion Act, responding to the sentiments expressed in this cartoon, which was published in the period. It says at the bottom, the yellow terror in all his glory, and the notion of the Chinese as endangering white Americans. All of this led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Law. And the law prohibited the entry of Chinese laborers, whether they were skilled or unskilled. And congressional sentiment was hardly unanimous. In the Senate, the vote was 32-15, with 29 not voting. All of the 15 were Republicans, and another 11 Republicans did not vote. But in the House, the bill passed easily and without debate. And the law was signed by President Chester Alan Arthur on May 6, 1882. And 6 years later, the Scott Act was passed, signed by Grover Cleveland, that limited acceptable immigrants from China to government officials, teachers, students, merchants, and tourists. In 1892, the Geary Act extended the Chinese Exclusion Law for another decade. But there was lots of evidence of anti-Asian sentiment, and not just against the Chinese. In 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt made an agreement with the Emperor of Japan that very dramatically cut the admission of Japanese workers into the United States. The Immigration Act of 1882, which was also passed at the same time the Chinese Exclusion Law, was the first general immigration law in American history. It placed a 50-cent head tax on incoming ship passengers to defray immigration expenses. It placed immigration under the Secretary of the Treasury as supervisor of the business of immigration, which suggests to you exactly how the Congress was looking at immigration as an aspect of business. And because he was responsible for customs, the supervisor of immigration could use existing inspectors to contract with state boards for administering and processing immigration. And the legislation provided for the deportation of foreign convicts and allowed for foreign labor to sign contracts with American employers. But only 3 years later, the Foreign Act, F-O-R-A-N, made contract labor illegal altogether. Well, all of this was happening again in the 1880s, but between 1880 and the 1920s, 23.5 million newcomers arrived. It is the busiest immigration period in American history until the present. It was not just the United States that was receiving immigration. In fact, our friends, the demographers, tell us that more people were on the move in this period than at any other time. And it was not just the United States that was a recipient country. Argentina, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all of them were receiving immigrants and needed immigrant labor. As for the United States, most of our immigrants were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, which meant many more Catholics and now Eastern European Jews. There was no shortage of ink spilled in opposition, and Congress was no longer content to rely on the states in any way to process newcomers. And so the Immigration Act of March 3rd, 1891, signed by Benjamin Harrison, established exclusive federal control over immigration and created a federal superintendent of immigration. Now immigrants would be interrogated and examined. The act barred idiots, insane persons, paupers, persons likely to become public charges, persons suffering from loathsome, dangerous, contagious diseases, persons convicted of a felony or crime involving moral turpitude or polygamy. It excluded people convicted of political offenses. And so here's what the fear was. This is a death's head coming into New York Harbor. You can't see the belt it's wearing. It says cholera. There was a fear of disease being brought with immigration. And so the response to this were depots like New York's Ellis Island, where there would be an inspection. Here's the Great Hall at Ellis, where the immigrants were brought, and where on the perimeter they would be inspected by the physicians of the U.S. Marine Hospital Service, renamed in 1913 the Public Health Service. They, to this day, follow the naval protocol whites in the summer, blues in the winter. And here is one of those physicians looking into the eyes of giving the clinical gaze to this newly arrived immigrant woman. There were inspections and chalk marks made on the lapel of immigrants who needed further inspection. It was the Victorian era, so there were male physicians examining male immigrants, and the first female physician in the U.S. Public Health Service, Rose Bebb, with a stethoscope around her neck, examining female patients. There were also mental exams, like this one being administered by E.H. Mullen, who developed this block test to test the mental acuity of newly arrived immigrants. And there was an appeal process, and if the appeal was not won on Ellis Island, there was a Federal Commissioner of Immigration in Washington who was the last person, the last resort. Most of the immigrants coming in through Ellis Island were European, but not all. This lady is from the French West Indies, and in 1911 she arrived at Ellis Island and came into the United States. On the West Coast, there was Angel Island, and there most of the newcomers were Asians coming from China, coming from other parts of Asia, Japan, and so on, and undergoing a similar kind of inspection procedure. And so now immigration was a federal matter, and those who opposed immigration now had to petition for federal legislation. Among those who opposed blanket immigration restrictions was Woodrow Wilson. I know Woodrow Wilson has a very mixed reputation these days, but he was someone who was really very friendly toward immigration, very favorably disposed toward immigration. And when a bill was suggested, a literacy bill, testing the literacy of all newcomers to the United States, Wilson vetoed it. In fact, he vetoed it several times, but Congress ultimately overrode his veto by a vote of 287 to 106 in the House and 62 to 19 in the Senate. But the law was never very effective. There was a lot of lobbying went on as to which languages would be tested, literacy, and which languages were legitimate. For example, both Hebrew and Yiddish were added as languages because of the pressure from members of the Jewish community to have both languages recognized for purposes of literacy testing. And then there was the matter of gender. If a husband was literate, a wife need not be. And other women in the family, such as mothers and grandmothers, or widowed or unmarried daughters of a literate male alien, were not required to demonstrate literacy themselves. Overall, the policy was difficult to enforce and was a failure. But that did not stop the advocates of immigration restriction. And certainly by the 1920s, groups like the Immigration Restriction League and the Ku Klux Klan, seen here marching up Pennsylvania Avenue during the 1920s, were pushing hard for more permanent and more restrictive immigration. The Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924, named for Albert Johnson, congressman from Washington, and Senator David Reed of Pennsylvania, established a national origin quota system that limited each country to an annual quota that consisted of 2% of those from that country, 2% of those already in the US from that country, according to the 1890 census. Because 1890 was before the large thrust of immigration, and from the nativist perspective, that was the point, to limit the number of newcomers from Southern and Eastern Europe and parts of Asia who could come into the United States. The law was signed by Calvin Coolidge, and it was American immigration law, the main law governing immigration, this quota system, until the 1960s. So if you think about the Chinese Exclusion Law of 1882, the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, and now the 1924 Immigration Act, it was pretty restrictive. Moreover, after the great crash and onset of economic depression in the early 1930s, it became even more difficult to get into the United States. President Herbert Hoover preferred not to go back to Congress for more restrictive legislation, and so he counted on the consular officials in various American consulates to place a real tight grip on immigration to the United States. The United States was not generous toward displaced persons and refugees after World War II. Indeed, if you combine those who came as a result of the Displaced Persons Act of 1948 and the 1953 Refugee Relief Act, only about 400,000 newcomers arrived in the United States. The Mccarran Walter Act was a Cold War measure that sought to open the doors to those who were fleeing communist nations. And in fact, there was a great deal of interest in doing that. Special legislation was passed to welcome the Hungarians after an abortive attempt at an uprising in 1956, and then special legislation for the Cubans in 1959. As for other groups, well, the Cold War provided an opportunity for Soviet Jews to exit the Soviet Union. And there was a great deal of pressure during the 1970s by Jews who had come from concentration camps and fallen into the Soviet zone, and who were in the Soviet Union to leave the Soviet Union. And so there was legislation passed on a trade bill. And there was an amendment to that sponsored by Scoop Jackson of Washington and Charles Vanek of Congressman from Ohio, called the Jackson-Vanek Amendment to this trade bill, which told the Soviet Union that they could have most favored nation status in terms of trade, but only if they allowed emigration, the immigration of Soviet Jews. Gerald Ford signed the measure in December of 1973. But again, as I said a moment ago, there was no major law until 1965. And then Philip Hart and Emanuel Seller sponsored the law, which still is the governing law of American immigration. It eliminated the national origins quotas and substituted hemispheric quotas and limited every country to 20,000 immigrants per year. Now, prior to 1965, there were no real limits on emigration from countries within the hemisphere, and Mexicans and Central Americans had crossed America's southern border back and forth for purposes of work regularly. They were part of a migrant labor force. But now, with this quota system in place, those migrants were considered undocumented. They were considered unauthorized. And so, along with the 1965 legislation, came a new issue, the issue, big time, of undocumented aliens. In addition to that, in 1980, the Congress passed a Refugee Act, which adopted the language of the United Nations that defined a refugee as someone who had a well-founded fear of persecution. And there is a separate quota for refugees, which will be determined by the president. We've heard a lot about that recently as Mr. Biden has gone back and forth about how many refugees are going to be admitted. That law back in 1965, as I said, is the prevailing law, except for one other. And this is Lyndon Johnson signing the law. Johnson said of that law, that 65 law, that it really wouldn't make much of a difference. Of course, he was wrong. It opened up the door enormously to immigrants from various parts of the world that before had been limited by the national origins quotas. Many more immigrants from parts of Africa, for example, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Somalia, Kenya, could come to the United States under this legislation. Ronald Reagan sought to remedy the issue of undocumented aliens by issuing an amnesty in 1986 and then signing the Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA as it was called, which placed the onus of enforcing immigration law on employers. It is still in effect. It is not a very popular act, and it is often not enforced. What to do about the undocumented, and what to do especially by those children who came into the United States with parents who were undocumented or unauthorized when they entered the United States. And of course, President Obama, by executive action, gave us the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA. And looks very, very much like DACA is going to be saved. It was under attack by President Trump, but President Biden is very, very much committed to the young people who have come forward and enrolled in the DACA program. So let me conclude by saying that, this issue of immigration has been a constant in American life. And the fear of the foreign-born has also been a constant in American life. As we look across the globe, there are many host countries, as well as the United States, where there is a backlash against immigration right now. Commenting on the power of fear throughout history, the philosopher Bertrand Russell once observed that collective fear stimulates herd instinct and tends to produce ferocity toward those who are not regarded as members of the herd. I would suggest to you that that ferocity is sometimes still apparent in American life. We saw it in Charlottesville. We saw it on the steps of the Capitol on January 6th. And it is part of a larger pattern. And that pattern, I would suggest to you, is the American as a people, the American nation as a nation of paradox. We both court immigrants and fear them at the same time. And I suspect that that pattern will continue for many, many years to come. So let me stop there and turn it back for some questions. And Jane, I think you're going to be moderating. Am I correct?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Dr. Kraut. That we have certainly had a lot of information about how immigration has been handled by this country, by the Congress in particular. And so we invite you to join in the questions. Those of you in the audience can put a question into the Q&A. And we have two that are pending. And Dr. Kraut, we're sort of at the, toward the end of our time. So if we try to answer questions as briefly as possible, that'll allow us to get people to get their questions in. And can you touch for a moment on the immigration of Ukrainians immediately following the Second World War?
Yes, there were many thousands of Ukrainians who were came into the United States under the Displaced Persons Act. People often think that most of the Ukrainians who came in at that point were Jewish. It's not the case. In fact, there were many more Catholic Ukrainians who managed to enter the United States under the Displaced Persons Act in 1948. So there was a large influx then.
And is there a quota system now? You indicated 20,000 per country?
Yes. This is, of course, exclusive of bringing in relatives. And so sometimes relatives can be brought in beyond the 20,000 quota. But that law, that 1965 law, is still in effect. It is the prevailing immigration legislation that governs the United States. And of course, we've expanded it in certain ways. We've tried to place a greater emphasis on occupational preference, for example, to bring in the high-tech people we want in the United States. But this is sort of tinkering around the edges. And when presidents like President Biden calls for comprehensive immigration reform, what he's talking about is an overhaul of the system, which, in my own opinion, it badly needs. We really need to figure out what the United States expects in terms of the talents of immigrants and maximize our chances to get the people we want into the United States. At the same time, we want to continue to be a country that is benevolent and that is compassionate for those who are in flight. And I think you see how we're trying to do that somewhat unsuccessfully at the moment down on the border, down on the southern border. We want to honor amnesty claims. We want to respect those who truly have a well-founded fear of persecution. And yet at the same time, there have to be some kinds of controls in place. And we're trying to figure that out quite literally, even as we speak.
And as we look at one of the things in your background, can you tell me during the 1918 pandemic, you indicated you wrote an article about how did we deal with immigrants during that time and the fear of contagion, and speak about that, please.
Yes. Throughout history, certain groups have been blamed for the appearance of epidemics. In the Middle Ages, Jews were blamed for the Black Death of the Middle Ages that wiped out about a third of Europe, and many were tortured and killed because of that. In the American history, in 1832, the Irish were blamed for cholera. In 1916, the Italian laborers were blamed for polio. And this was a pattern. In 1918, what's interesting to me about it is that no one group was singled out. It was called the Spanish Influenza, and people knew it as the Spanish flu. But the reason for that was not the stigmatization of the Spanish, because Spain was a neutral in World War I. And so news of the pandemic and how it was spreading was coming to the West through Spain. And so since the news was coming from Spain, people started to call it the Spanish influenza. In point of fact, in the United States and in other countries, there was much less stigmatization of the foreign-born than there had been previously. And the article that I wrote about 10 years ago talked to the issue of Italian and Eastern European Jewish migrants and how they were being blamed for many other things, but not for the pandemic of 1918. There was a war on. Many of them had sent their sons to fight for this country in that war. And so there was a great reticence to blame anyone for the pandemic because of where they were born or the fact that they had emigrated to the United States.
And if you were to, using this vast historical knowledge that you have, if you were in charge, imagine you were just, you didn't have to deal with getting elected, Congress, whatever. What would you write as the perfect immigration policy for this country?
The first thing I would do would be to establish a commission that would have representatives of labor and manufacturing, agriculture, every conceivable economic interest, and I would commission the commission to draw up a 5-year plan for exactly what the American economy needed in terms of talent and expertise. And I would use that as the basis for determining admissions and make occupational preference the key variable, allowing again also for family reunification and for some compassionate admissions. In addition to that, though, I would establish something called immigrant policy, which we have never had in this country. We've had immigration policy, but unlike some societies, we don't have an immigrant policy. If people wish to learn English, they go to a private agency or they go to public schools that are paid for by states and localities. The government of the United States currently does not pay for any of that. It makes some payments to refugees to help them get resettled, but not to routine immigrants. And so I would probably change that and have a policy that would facilitate the integration of the foreign-born into American life. And so again, my goal in all of this is to rationalize immigration policy. In the meantime, of course, there has to be enforcement at the borders. Of course, we can't permit everybody to come to America who wants to come to America, but we need to do it fairly, rationally, and in the best interests of the United States of America going forward, the best economic interests.
Well, thank you so much for your time, your talent, and such a fascinating conversation. We have time for one more very quick answer to a question, okay, which is from one of our listeners. As we work to legalize and provide a path for citizenship for those who entered the country illegally, what message do you think we're sending to people around the world who dream of coming to the United States and have been waiting to get their visa?
I think the message is, if you have something to offer the United States, and you do, then share your life with the United States. We want to offer a path to citizenship, and we should offer a path to citizenship for all who come here. We want people who want to buy in and invest their lives in the United States of America. And therefore, I very strongly encourage a path to citizenship. I think it's the key to everything, to have a coherent society and a society that basically is as unified as it can possibly be. We will always be a country of many people from many backgrounds, many religious backgrounds, racial identities, and so on. But we need to agree in principle on a set of beliefs and values that can be guaranteed by offering citizenship, the opportunity to really become part of the United States. And that's our responsibility, to welcome newcomers.
And obviously this conversation is not one that can be had in 1 hour. And I want to alert our listeners that we do have a follow-up conversation that is coming up on May the 27th, where we're focusing particularly on immigration in the 20th and 21st century, where Professor Carrie Rosenbaum, who is an immigration attorney in private practice, a law professor and a scholar, we'll be talking about current immigration, particularly intersections of criminal, employment, and constitutional law. So this discussion continues in 2 weeks. As we look ahead to our Lunch Bites series, are our Tuesday series, and our Lunch Bites series are a fun series to talk about things that are going on at the Capitol, the stories of the Capitol, the stories of the area, the Capitol neighborhood. And so next Tuesday, the 18th, we have coming up Lunch Bites Part 2.5. Those of you who tried to tune in earlier last week learned that our beloved Steve Livengood, who is our chief tour guide and public historian, had some internet connectivity problems at his condo, and he had to zoom over here quickly. So we only got half of his story about the Cox corridors. So we're going to get the rest of the story on May 18th. So join us for that. And then we have a special feature on Tuesday, June 1st with Dr. James Banner. And this is a book talk that y'all will love because you all are history lovers. Dr. Banner has just published a book called The Ever-Changing Past: Why All History is Revisionist History. He is a distinguished scholar with degrees from Yale and Columbia, has been a member of the history department at Princeton, and has a very distinguished career. So we will be able to join and look at that. So we hope you'll join us for all of these. And you all know I have to do my commercial. This is available only because of the generous support of members and friends of the Capitol Historical Society. Please make your donations and be as generous as possible. As you're thinking about, it may be time you're thinking about holiday gifts. Think about our incredible marble. You can see in the background the bookends that I have made with marble from the Capitol. We have lovely mugs, We the People, and other exciting activities. Great Father's Day present. If you've got a father who is a reader, the bookends will be a great choice. So thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Kraut. Thank you for your time.
Jane.
Thank you for your talent. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Be well. Goodbye.
Bye-bye now.